アムステルダム自由大学のキース・カウナー先生よりご発表いただきます。
Thank you very much for introducing me and a preliminary remark on our project. I have to clarify that our project, which is a project funded by the European Commission, is not a project to reform graduate education or admission to graduate education in Europe. But for those master's programs that say, I think I have a problem, we say we try to build tools and a toolkit that may help you to make your problem manageable and solve your problem. So it's the development of a toolkit that people might find useful or not. The project is a European project, but it's run from my university in the Netherlands, which we locate there on the map. We have currently 71 degree programs, which are taught in English. We have some 24,000 students. We have one of the larger graduate populations in research universities in the Netherlands. We have not that many international students, we think 1,700. We are a comprehensive university with the Dutch characteristic that the comprehensive universities don't have engineering. We pride ourselves to be a world-class research university. The three core messages of my presentation is that in the European context, admitting diverse students to master's programs is becoming more and more important and still pretty difficult. Second core message is that we are developing this toolkit in the Mastermind project, which we feel can be useful for master's programs that face with this problem. But I'm also here to learn from the situation in Japan to further improve our program. In continental Europe, before Bologna, let's say before 2000, we had a rather monolithic degree structure, only one degree before the PhD. You had to qualify as already somebody competent to start individual research on your PhD program. If you would fail, you would become a dropout. So that was a big problem, and one of the reasons I think the Bologna reform was very good was that it made that separation between the first cycle, we say, but in many countries it's called the bachelor's degree, and the second cycle, which we call the master's. After a few years, more and more professors came to say this master's program could be made into a thing of its own. What we saw since 2005 was the beginning of a revolution of design of master's programs as an educational entity, an educational concept of its own. And as a consequence, it increases the tendency of students to look for a change of menu after their bachelor's programs. Then I get to what I put into the circle. In the European context, the idea of going to another university and admission to another program has always been very strongly dominated by the paradigm of recognition. Can we equate your diploma enough to my own diploma, which gives a right of admission to the next phase in my own institution? So we stamp the diploma as recognized or as non-recognized. That is the recognition paradigm. You would say, we do not recognize your diploma. That was the legal term that you had to use. And sometimes you had to hide the reasons underneath. That's what I signified with the black hole, because it was very difficult to explain to the student. The master's programs are faced with an increasing diversity, complexity, and versatility of what graduates from master's programs need to know and be able to do, and how to behave themselves in the world outside. Employment skills, soft skills are the flavor of the month. International skills are very important in the European context. They will work in an international environment. Tuning was a project in Europe, started 15 years ago, maybe. We bring together professors in a specific subject area from different countries, and we don't give them an assignment. We don't tell them you need to arrive at a common conclusion, and try to avoid interference from educationalists, politicians, or diplomats. Let them talk. And one of the things they focused on was how to create a better and more concrete language to talk about these generic competencies. And I copied a list of 31 generic competencies that were generated in these discussions. And these might be interesting for you too, because these are competencies defined at the exit level. Master's programs in Europe want to have a diverse class of students because the key objective of internationalization of higher education is to give them the competencies that they need in the workplace when they're faced with people from other culture. The intercultural competence is not just something for the labor market outside the university. A PhD, supervisor, professor needs to have it too. So, in setting up the Mastermind Europe project, we first said we think that there is a fairly common and growing problem for master's programs, that the traditional recognition-based admission process is no longer working as well as people want. And the second step was that we think that looking at actually the competencies of the applicants themselves maybe can help solve the problem in the admission process. And then we looked at the European Commission structure and it was an Erasmus Plus program. It's the overarching program of the European Commission for all its efforts to stimulate anything in education and training and youth. And in part of that program, we set up a consortium with a number of universities and other institutions and made a proposal to the Commission. We want to develop this Mastermind Europe toolkit. And they said, okay, we like that, so we give you some money. And that's how the project started. And the consortium consists of a number of universities. And then we had a number of other institutions. There is the Academic Cooperation Association. And then 2 private companies join us. So we said we want to see if we can help solve the problem of admission by assessment of competencies. I'll give you an example. I see programs that say we look at the GPA. They assume that the GPA is a good indicator for intellectual ability. Now, we want to bring these things out, and they say we take a margin between 3.4 and 3.7, which is how good they need to be at it. But we try to disentangle that. And then the last point, how do you organize transparent answers? That is our conviction, is that the better and the more clear and transparent you can tell your students, this is what we are looking for, the higher is the likelihood that the right kind of applicants will turn up at your door, send in their applications to you. How good do they have to be? And there we try to identify 3 main domains. One is that of substance-related subject and skills. The second one is general academic competencies. And the third one is personal competencies and traits. So, in the course of the project, we have been working on creating one common language. And what we find is that the work leads to very similar categorization and subcategories for general academic and personal competencies as has been developed in the tuning project, automatic recognition, the European Qualifications Framework, and the ECTS. The ECTS is the European Credit Transfer System. So I want to say a few things about these 3 categories. The first category is subject-related knowledge and skills. The traditional method, usually these masters grow out of one faculty. But for instance, they need to make the shift to multidisciplinary and say, okay, how much is the common core of knowledge that we want to have? We propose that a quicker way to get that and also get commitment is simply ask the senior academics in your program and sit them around the table and ask, what do they need to have? This is a good way. The second and the third are a little bit more interesting because there we try to set up a conceptual analytical framework to help academic program directors at master's level to articulate for themselves what do my students have to be good at in terms of general academic and later personal stuff. We are now also working to a more quick and dirty approach, how you can answer this question, how good do they have to be in this part? And then the third, and that's the most difficult one in our project, is the personal competencies and traits. And the first big distinction that we want to make here is between personal traits and competencies, and that is the behavior that you show, which is the kind of marriage between the traits deep down in your soul and what you have learned and how you have learned to handle yourself in a social environment. The program can actually try to change the personal competencies more than it can try to change the personal traits. So we dug up from the literature a number of competencies that social psychologists say is very important for study success. But also, this is too complicated and burdensome, so we also have to identify some quick and dirty approach steps. In our coherent admission framework tool, I come back, first of all, of course, to this question. If you ask, how good do they have to be? The implicit question also is, good for what? In the Coherent Framework tool, we've developed and are developing brochures, guiding tools, and also some question lists and some formats that people can use to improve their own system. We also look at what kind of tools are being used. Triangulation that I'd like to highlight from this slide. Many universities already practice, and this is something that we are strongly supporting. And a very important thing is to use different mechanisms to find probable answers to the same question. And final part of the coherent admission framework is visualized in this picture as a logical part of the chain of contact between the university and the student. Admission should be part of that chain, but it should also be part of the chain of the program development, from ideally identifying needs in the labor market, and should be defined at the end of the day by what is needed in the labor market, and this should be a cyclical process. I think I might want to add a third dimension there. It's also part of what, in terms of strategic rationales, the university and the country want with international students. We're also going to look at the legal obstacles. There's a lot of perceived, imagined obstacles that do not really exist in real practice. But if you really look at the text of the law, much more is allowed if you go through the proper channels and explain what you want to do and why, than people assume. If you ask a lawyer, how can we do this in a legal way? It's the phrasing of the question that really decides the issue. Three core messages. Many programs in Europe are facing an increasing need for a diverse classroom in terms of nationality, in terms of disciplinarity, also to respond to the increasing diverse needs of the labor market. Their current admission process is not ideally suited for that diverse classroom, and we are trying to develop a toolkit that can help them towards a different approach to admission of students, slightly reducing the current risk of false negatives, of not taking in the students who would have done well had you only had the tools to find out. Okay. It is, I think, a fairly straightforward tool. Just show which language tests are available and how you could convert scores between the tests. We will try to look a little bit more into the bridge between language proficiency and general academic competence and cultural differences in how to handle language proficiency. I think it's important not to have a strict division of responsibilities between the administrative admission staff and the academics. The academics must answer the tough subjective questions. The administrators help the academics by posing the right questions. I think there is a need for admission staff who are competent in this language of competency-based admission. Yes, I think the degree profiles are now part of the European Qualification Framework and the Qualification Framework of the European Higher Education area. Degree profiles belong to the various attempts to discuss and agree on what are the learning outcomes It's the same kind of language creation effort, but we don't try to have political compromises. We just give you the language and you make your own statement.